The morning my brother was placed in handcuffs on land our family had owned for nearly 40 years, HOA President Vanessa Drake stood 20 feet away and smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a relieved smile, the smile of someone watching a plan unfold exactly the way she expected. At the time, I thought she was celebrating a victory. I didn't know she was standing at the edge of a disaster that would eventually destroy everything she had spent years building. 3 months later, county investigators, attorneys, auditors, and angry homeowners would all be asking the same question. How had a lie this big survived for so long? My name is Ethan Walker. My family owned 87 acres along the northern edge of Pine Creek Estates. The land had belonged to us for decades, long before the subdivision existed, long before the HOA existed. Long before Vanessa Drake had ever heard of Pine Creek, there was nothing complicated about the ownership. The property boundaries were recorded, the taxes were paid, the surveys were documented. The county records were clear. That's why none of us took the first violation notice seriously. The letter arrived less than a month after my father's funeral. At first glance, it looked like a routine HOA warning. Then I noticed the parcel number. They weren't talking about a neighbor's property. They were talking about ours. According to the notice, several structures on our land violated HOA regulations and needed to be removed immediately. I read the letter twice before laughing. The whole thing was ridiculous. That laughter disappeared the moment I called the HOA office. The woman who answered sounded confident until I explained who I was, then her tone changed. She placed me on hold for several minutes before returning with a message from HOA President Vanessa Drake. According to Vanessa, the violations were valid, the property belonged within HOA jurisdiction, and further enforcement action would follow if we failed to comply. There was no hesitation in her response, no uncertainty. She sounded like someone reading from a conclusion she had already reached. 2 days later, Vanessa showed up at our property. She arrived with 2 HOA board members and a thick black folder tucked beneath her arm. The moment she stepped out of the vehicle, I understood why so many residents avoided confrontation with her. She carried herself like someone accustomed to winning, not because she was right, but because people eventually got tired of fighting her. She walked past me without introducing herself, stopped near our equipment barn, and pointed at the structure. That building needs to be removed. No, it doesn't. It violates HOA standards. It's older than the HOA. That doesn't matter. The confidence in her voice immediately bothered me. People making honest mistakes usually ask questions. Vanessa wasn't asking questions. She wasn't interested in facts. She was delivering instructions. My brother Ryan stepped forward. You don't control this land. For the first time, Vanessa smiled. It wasn't the smile itself that bothered me, it was how quickly it appeared. Almost as if she had been waiting for someone to challenge her. You should be careful about making assumptions, she said quietly. The words weren't threatening, but the certainty behind them was. Then she opened her folder, only for a second, but that second would stay in my mind for weeks. Inside was a map. At first glance it looked official, then I noticed something strange. The boundary lines were wrong, not slightly wrong, completely wrong. I only saw it for a moment before she closed the folder again, but I knew what I had seen. The map didn't match any survey I had ever encountered. At the time, I assumed it was outdated paperwork. I would later discover that map was the foundation of everything. The violations intensified after that meeting, not weekly, not every few days, almost every day. Each notice became more aggressive than the last. Fines appeared, deadlines appeared, threats appeared. Every document referenced inspections, reports, photographs, observations, and enforcement actions. Someone had spent an enormous amount of time building a case against us. And people don't build cases unless they're preparing to use them. Ryan ignored every notice, every fine, every warning, every threat. He stuffed them into a cardboard box in the garage and went back to work. For several weeks, nothing happened. Then came Thursday morning. 3 sheriff's vehicles rolled onto our property shortly after sunrise. The moment I saw them, I knew something was wrong. Deputies stepped out and headed directly toward Ryan, who was clearing brush near the northern fence line. Within minutes, neighbors began gathering along the road. More appeared on porches. Phones came out, conversations stopped. Nobody knew what was happening, but everyone sensed it wasn't routine. One deputy informed Ryan that a formal complaint had been filed accusing him of damaging landscaping located on HOA-owned community property. For a moment, I honestly thought it was a joke. The brush Ryan was removing sat well inside our fence line. The fence had been there for years, everyone knew it. Then another vehicle arrived, Vanessa. The second she stepped out, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. She wasn't surprised, she wasn't confused, she wasn't curious, she looked prepared. As if she had known exactly what was going to happen before anyone else. The deputies questioned Ryan while Vanessa stood nearby observing everything. Ryan produced tax records, survey photographs, county documents, and property records. The evidence clearly supported our ownership, yet the questioning continued. Every time the conversation seemed ready to end, Vanessa produced another document from her folder. Then one of the deputies reviewed several pages, looked at Ryan, and said something that instantly changed the atmosphere. "If these records are accurate, you may be occupying property that doesn't belong to you." The crowd fell silent. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Vanessa spoke. "That's what we've been trying to explain." Several neighbors heard her, several neighbors recorded it, and in that moment the rumors began. People stopped looking confused. They started looking suspicious. The deputy instructed Ryan to step away from the tractor. Ryan complied. Another deputy approached. Then, in front of dozens of neighbors, my brother was placed in handcuffs while they attempted to verify ownership records. I will never forget that moment, not because of the handcuffs. Not because of the crowd, because of what I saw on Vanessa's face. Relief, not satisfaction. Relief, as though something important had finally happened, as though she had been worried it might not. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about violations, it wasn't about landscaping, and it wasn't about HOA rules. There was something else, something Vanessa wanted. Something valuable enough to justify everything she was doing. The deputies eventually removed the handcuffs after additional records were reviewed and county officials were contacted. Ryan wasn't arrested, no charges were filed, but the damage had already been done. By lunchtime, rumors were spreading throughout Pine Creek Estates. By dinner, residents were openly discussing whether our family had illegally occupied HOA property for years. The following morning, I found a sealed legal notice attached to our front gate. I assumed it was another violation. It wasn't. I read the first page, then the second, then the third. With every page, the situation became more unbelievable. The HOA had formally initiated legal proceedings claiming ownership rights over a significant portion of our property. Attached to the filing was the same map I had seen inside Vanessa's folder. For the first time, I was able to examine it properly. The boundaries were wrong. The measurements were wrong, even some of the landmarks were wrong. Yet at the bottom of the document sat an official county approval stamp, a stamp that made absolutely no sense. I spent most of that night staring at the map, studying every line, every number. Every signature. The longer I looked, the less logical it became. Then, shortly after 2 in the morning, I noticed something, one tiny detail, a single date. At first, I thought I was reading it incorrectly. Then I checked again, and suddenly every hair on my arm stood up, because if that date was genuine, the document couldn't possibly be legitimate. And if the document wasn't legitimate, then someone hadn't simply made a mistake, someone had manufactured evidence. The problem was that I still didn't know who. And by the time I found the answer, half the neighborhood would wish they had never heard the name Vanessa Drake. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I looked away from the map, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened over the previous month. The violations, the threats, the sheriff's deputies. Ryan standing in handcuffs while half the neighborhood watched. None of it made sense anymore. If Vanessa had simply made a mistake, she would have backed down the moment real property records appeared. Instead, she kept pushing harder. That meant one of two things. Either she knew she was wrong and didn't care, or she genuinely believed something protected her. Neither possibility was comforting. Around 3 in the morning, I stopped trying to sleep and drove to my office. The map sat folded on the passenger seat the entire way. I spread it across my desk and examined every detail again. The boundaries were wrong, the measurements were wrong, several landmarks didn't match reality, yet somehow an official county approval stamp sat at the bottom of the page. That stamp bothered me more than anything else, because if it was real, the map shouldn't exist. And if it wasn't real, then somebody had committed a very serious crime. At sunrise, I called the only person I knew who might have answers, Frank Dawson. Frank had spent nearly 3 decades working with county land records. If a document existed, Frank could usually tell you where it came from, who filed it, and whether it belonged in the archives. When I arrived at the county records building, Frank was already waiting. The moment he saw the map, his expression changed. Not confusion, not curiosity, recognition, and that frightened me far more than confusion would have. Without saying a word, he took the document and carried it into a back office. 10 minutes later, he returned looking noticeably paler. "Where did you get this?" "The HOA. Frank looked down at the map again, then back at me. "They're actually using this?" The question immediately caught my attention. "What does that mean?" For several seconds, Frank didn't answer. Then he opened a filing cabinet and removed a thick binder covered in dust. He placed it on the table between us. "This map was never supposed to leave county storage." I felt my stomach tighten. "What?" Frank flipped through several pages before stopping at an old development application. "This is Pine Creek Estates." I looked down. The map looked familiar, very familiar. Then I noticed something strange. The boundaries matched the document Vanessa had shown us, exactly. "What am I looking at?" Frank slowly leaned back. "The original proposal." I frowned. "Proposal?" "It was rejected." For a moment I thought I had misheard him. "What do you mean rejected?" Frank pointed toward a large red stamp across the first page. DENIED. I stared at the document, then at the map in my hands, then back at the document again. The boundaries were identical, the same boundaries Vanessa was using, the same boundaries used to justify fines, the same boundaries used to put handcuffs on my brother. The same boundaries now being used in legal filings against my family. My pulse started accelerating. If this was rejected, why is the HOA using it? Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another folder, then another, then another. Each contained additional documents related to Pine Creek Estates. Finally, he stopped and slid a second map across the table. At first glance, it looked identical, then I noticed the difference. Our family's property wasn't included. I looked at Frank. "This one," he nodded. "That's the approved version." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The entire room suddenly felt smaller, because a simple mistake no longer explained what was happening. Somebody had access to both maps, somebody had chosen the wrong one, and somebody had been using it for years. Frank seemed to be thinking the exact same thing. "Ethan, this gets worse." I wasn't sure I wanted to hear those words. "How?" Frank turned several pages and pointed at a collection of easement agreements. "Look at the dates." I did. Then I looked again. The dates didn't make sense. Several documents referenced boundaries that only existed on the rejected map, not the approved one. My confusion deepened. "What am I missing?" Frank exhaled slowly. "These agreements should never have been approved." "Why?" "Because they reference land the HOA doesn't own." The words hung in the air. Suddenly everything felt very quiet. "How many agreements?" Frank's expression darkened. "More than 20. I stared at him. 20 separate agreements, 20 separate documents. 20 separate opportunities for somebody to notice the mistake, yet somehow nobody had, or perhaps somebody had, and stayed quiet. That possibility bothered me far more. Then Frank opened one final folder. What happened next changed everything. Inside sat copies of annual HOA financial reports, maintenance budgets, contractor payments, insurance records, and property improvement expenses. At first, none of it seemed important. Then Frank pointed toward a series of numbers. "Look at these." I leaned closer. The HOA had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years maintaining property they didn't legally own. Walking trails, drainage systems, landscape projects, storage buildings. Recreation areas, everything sat on land claimed through the rejected map. I felt my stomach drop, because for the first time I understood why Vanessa was fighting so hard. If the HOA admitted the truth, the consequences would be catastrophic. The lawsuits alone could destroy them. Then Frank said something that made the entire situation even worse. "That's not the biggest problem." I looked up. "What is?" Frank slid another document toward me. It was an audit report, a very old one. Most of it seemed routine until I reached the final page. There, buried deep in the report, sat a handwritten note, only one sentence, but it changed everything. "Boundary discrepancy requires immediate correction." I read it twice, then 3 times. My heartbeat accelerated. "Frank, I know." "They knew." Frank nodded slowly. "Somebody knew." The room fell silent, because that note was dated 17 years earlier. 17 years. Which meant the HOA hadn't just been operating under a mistake. At least one person had discovered the problem nearly 2 decades ago, and instead of fixing it, they buried it. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Then another question entered my mind, the question that changed the entire direction of the investigation. Who wrote the note? Frank looked at the signature. Then his expression changed. Immediately, completely, the color drained from his face. "What?" He didn't answer. Frank, still nothing. Finally, he pushed the report across the table. I looked at the signature. The name at the bottom of the page made my blood run cold. Because the person who discovered the discrepancy 17 years earlier wasn't some accountant. Wasn't some auditor, wasn't some county employee. The signature belonged to Vanessa Drake's husband, and according to county records, he had died under extremely unusual circumstances less than 6 months after writing it. For several seconds, I simply stared at the signature. Then I looked at it again, then a third time. The name hadn't changed, the words hadn't changed, the date hadn't changed, yet the more I looked at the report, the less sense it made. Vanessa Drake's husband had discovered the boundary discrepancy 17 years earlier. He had documented it. He had formally recommended it be corrected, and less than 6 months later, he was dead. "What exactly do you mean by unusual circumstances?" I asked. Frank hesitated. That alone worried me. In nearly 30 years of dealing with land disputes, property lawsuits, and county investigations, Frank wasn't easily shaken, yet something about this made him uncomfortable. "He died in a single-vehicle accident." I frowned. "A car crash?" Frank nodded. "Officially." The way he emphasized the word officially immediately caught my attention. "What does that mean?" Frank rubbed his forehead. "It means people talked." "What people?" "County employees, contractors, surveyors, a few developers." I waited. Frank lowered his voice. "Nobody ever proved anything, but a lot of people thought the timing was strange." A cold feeling settled in my stomach, because suddenly this wasn't just about a property dispute anymore. This was a problem that stretched back decades, a problem people had known about, a problem people had apparently chosen not to discuss. I looked down at the audit report again. 1 sentence. That was all. 1 sentence acknowledging the discrepancy. 1 sentence proving somebody had discovered the truth 17 years earlier. 1 sentence that should have triggered an investigation. Instead, it disappeared, just like the man who wrote it. "Who took over after he died?" I asked. Frank immediately answered. "Vanessa." I stared at him. "She became HOA president?" "No," he shook his head. "Not immediately." "Then what?" Frank leaned back in his chair. "She joined the board 6 months later." My stomach tightened. "And after that, 3 years later, she became president." The room went silent, because the timeline wasn't impossible, but it was uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. The person who discovered the discrepancy dies, the note disappears, the issue is never corrected. His wife joins the HOA board, then eventually becomes president. And for the next decade, the same false boundaries continue being used. The coincidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Then something else occurred to me. If she knew about the discrepancy, why keep using the map? Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid one of the financial reports toward me. "That's what bothers me." I looked down. Several figures had been highlighted. Large figures, very large figures, landscape contracts, maintenance projects, construction improvements, security upgrades, insurance reimbursements. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had moved through properties connected to the disputed land. Then I noticed something strange. The same contractor appeared repeatedly, year after year. Project after project, payment after payment. I pointed at the name. "Who's this?" Frank's expression darkened. "That's another problem." "What kind of problem?" "Look at the owner's name." I did. Then I froze because I recognized it immediately. The contractor wasn't owned by a developer or an investor or an outside company. The business belonged to Vanessa's brother. For several seconds, I just stared at the page. The same contractor had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in HOA work over the years. Almost all of it connected to land that legally shouldn't have belonged to the HOA in the first place. A very uncomfortable picture was beginning to form. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed Ryan. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. His voice sounded tense. "Ethan, what happened? You need to get home." My stomach immediately tightened. "Why?" "Someone broke into Dad's office." I was already standing. "What?" "They tossed the whole place." Every trace of calm disappeared. I grabbed my keys. "When?" "Last night." "Did they take anything?" There was a pause, then Ryan answered. "That's the strange part." My pulse accelerated. "What?" "They ignored the safe." I stopped moving. "What?" "The safe is untouched." For several seconds, neither of us spoke because everybody knew about the safe. Dad kept important documents there: property records, financial records, survey maps, insurance files. If somebody wanted valuable paperwork, the safe would be the first thing they targeted. Yet according to Ryan, it hadn't been touched. "What did they take?" Another pause, then Ryan gave an answer that instantly made my blood run cold. "Only one thing." I tightened my grip on the phone. "What?" "The old survey box." For a moment I couldn't speak. The survey box wasn't valuable. It contained decades-old copies of property maps and land records. Most people wouldn't even know what it was, which meant whoever entered the office knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it. I left the county records building less than a minute later. The entire drive home felt endless. Questions kept racing through my mind. Who knew the survey box existed? Who knew where it was stored? And more importantly, why would somebody risk breaking into private property to steal old survey documents? By the time I reached the ranch, sheriff's deputies were already there. Ryan stood outside the office building speaking with one of them. The moment he saw me, he walked over. "You need to see this." Without another word, he led me inside. The office looked like a tornado had gone through it. Cabinets emptied, drawers overturned, papers scattered everywhere, yet one thing immediately stood out: the damage wasn't random. Someone had searched very carefully. Every shelf connected to land records had been emptied. Every cabinet containing surveys had been opened. Every storage box related to property documents had been examined. Whoever did this wasn't looking for money, they were looking for information. Then Ryan pointed toward the floor. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed a small piece of paper partially hidden beneath an overturned filing cabinet. I crouched and pulled it free. The paper had been torn from a notebook. Only a few words remained visible. Most of the page was missing, but the surviving words were enough to make my heart stop. Because written across the paper were 3 words: "Do not file." For several seconds, I stared at the note. Then I flipped it over, and immediately felt every hair on my arm stand up. Because on the back was part of a signature I had already seen once before that day. The signature belonged to Vanessa Drake's husband. And suddenly the break-in wasn't the most important problem anymore, because if somebody had stolen the survey box, then somebody else knew the truth was getting close to the surface. The moment I saw the partial signature, every question in my head was replaced by a much more dangerous one. Who else knew? Up until that point, I had assumed the truth had been buried years ago. Hidden, forgotten, locked away inside old records nobody bothered reading anymore. But someone had broken into our property and stolen a box containing specific survey documents less than 24 hours after I started digging into county records. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a response. Someone was reacting to us. Someone was watching. I handed the torn paper to Ryan. He stared at it for several seconds, then his face changed. "You recognize it too?" I nodded. Neither of us needed to say the name, we were both thinking it. Vanessa's husband, the same man who had discovered the boundary discrepancy 17 years earlier. The same man whose warning had somehow disappeared. The same man whose signature now appeared on a note hidden inside my father's office. The problem was that none of it made sense. Why would a document connected to him be inside Dad's records, and why would someone risk a break-in to steal it? The questions kept multiplying. The answers weren't. The deputy handling the report spent nearly an hour documenting the damage. By the time he left, the sun was already beginning to set. Ryan and I remained inside the office. Neither of us felt like going home. Every drawer, every cabinet, every shelf, we searched everything. If the intruder missed something, we wanted to find it before they did. Around 9 o'clock, Ryan made an unexpected discovery. "Ethan," his voice immediately got my attention. "What's? Come here." He was standing beside an old filing cabinet near the back wall. One my father rarely used. The cabinet looked ordinary, until Ryan pulled the bottom drawer completely free. Hidden behind it was a small metal compartment. I stared at it. For 40 years I had been inside that office. I had never seen it before. Neither had Ryan. "What is that?" He shook his head. "No idea." The compartment was locked, not a large lock. Just a small key lock barely visible from the outside, the kind designed to remain unnoticed. My pulse immediately accelerated, because hidden compartments don't exist for ordinary paperwork. My father had hidden something. The question was what? Unfortunately, neither of us had the key. After spending nearly 20 minutes searching the office, we found nothing. Then Ryan remembered something. Dad's toolbox. I looked at him. "What about it?" He kept old keys in a coffee can. 10 minutes later, we were sitting on the office floor surrounded by dozens of rusted keys collected over decades. Most didn't fit. Some barely entered the lock. Then finally, on the 12th attempt, we heard a click. The compartment opened. Inside sat a single envelope, nothing else, no cash, no deeds, no photographs. Just one sealed envelope. The front contained only 3 words, "if needed later." For several seconds, neither of us moved, because we both recognized the handwriting. Dad's. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside were 4 items: a folded map, a photograph, a handwritten letter, and a flash drive. The photograph caught my attention first. The image looked old, very old. At least 20 years old. Several people stood together near a construction site. One of them was the original developer of Pine Creek Estates. I recognized him immediately from county records. Another was Vanessa's husband. The third person made my stomach tighten, because standing beside them was my father. For a moment I just stared, then Ryan took the photo from my hand. What the hell? That was exactly what I was thinking. As far as we knew, Dad barely knew the developer, yet here they were together, smiling, standing side by side. As if they had been working on the same project. Then I unfolded the map. The moment I saw it, my heart nearly stopped. It was another Pine Creek Estate survey. But unlike every other version we had seen, this one contained handwritten notes all over it. Circles, arrows, measurements, warnings, corrections, and in one corner sat a sentence written in red ink. A sentence that immediately explained why someone had stolen the survey box. "This version is the correct survey." The room went silent. Because if that statement was true, then every legal action Vanessa had taken was based on false boundaries. Every violation, every fine, every threat, every claim, all of it. Then I opened the letter. The handwriting belonged to my father. The first sentence made my blood run cold. "If you're reading this, then someone finally decided to force the issue." Ryan and I exchanged a look. Neither of us spoke. I continued reading. According to the letter, my father discovered the boundary discrepancy years earlier. Not 17 years earlier. Much earlier. In fact, he had discovered it before Vanessa's husband. The moment I read that sentence, everything changed, because it meant my father had known the truth for decades, and he never told us. The letter continued. My father explained that he had attempted to raise concerns with the developer years ago. The issue was supposedly resolved, or at least that's what he had been told. Then strange things started happening. Survey documents disappeared, records changed, meetings were canceled, people stopped returning calls. Eventually, he realized something much larger was happening behind the scenes, something involving multiple people, something powerful enough that nobody wanted to discuss it openly. Then I reached the final paragraph, and suddenly I understood why he had hidden the envelope. If anyone ever comes looking for the survey records, trust nobody until you know who benefits from the disputed land. I read the sentence twice, then 3 times. The words refused to leave my head. Who benefits from the disputed land, not who owns it, not who manages it, who benefits from it. The wording felt deliberate, very deliberate. Then Ryan picked up the flash drive. Maybe this explains it. I looked at him. He plugged the drive into the office computer. Several folders appeared, most contained scanned documents. Survey reports, meeting notes, property records. Then we noticed a folder labeled Private Meeting Recording. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The file was dated 19 years earlier. Long before Vanessa became HOA president, long before the legal threats, long before the violations, I clicked the recording. Static filled the speakers, then voices, 3 voices. The first belonged to the developer, the second belonged to Vanessa's husband. The third voice made my entire body go cold because I recognized it instantly, not from the past, from the present. The third voice belonged to someone still sitting on the Pine Creek HOA board today. For several seconds, neither Ryan nor I said a word. The recording continued playing through the office speakers, but I barely heard it. My attention was locked on that third voice. The voice belonged to Harold Bennett, current HOA board member. 22 years on the board, one of the most respected residents in Pine Creek Estates. The same man who constantly talked about transparency, responsibility, and protecting community interests. The same man who had stood beside Vanessa during nearly every public meeting. The same man who had watched my brother being placed in handcuffs without saying a single word. And somehow his voice was sitting inside a recording made nearly 2 decades earlier. Ryan paused the audio. That's Bennett. I nodded. There was no doubt, not even a little. The voice was unmistakable. My stomach tightened, because the moment Harold Bennett entered the picture, the entire situation became much more dangerous. Vanessa was one thing. A stubborn HOA president could be challenged, but Harold Bennett was different. People trusted him, residents listened to him, local officials knew him. For years, he had built a reputation as the reasonable voice on the board. If he was involved, then whatever had happened wasn't the work of one person. It was bigger, much bigger. I pressed play again. The recording crackled through the speakers. The developer spoke first. "We can't leave it like this." Another voice responded, Vanessa's husband. "If the correction gets filed, the entire project changes." Then came Harold Bennett, calm, controlled, confident. "Nobody is going to look at this 20 years from now." The room went silent. Ryan slowly looked at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us liked what we were hearing. The recording continued. Papers shuffled, chairs moved, someone poured coffee. Then the developer spoke again. "What happens if Walker notices?" My heart immediately started pounding. Walker, our family, my father. The conversation had suddenly become very personal. Vanessa's husband answered. "He already noticed." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. Then the recording continued. "He knows the boundaries are wrong." The developer muttered something under his breath. Then Harold Bennett spoke. "Leave him alone." Several seconds passed, then Bennett continued. "He's not interested in a fight." The recording stopped, just ended. No explanation, no conclusion. Nothing. I stared at the computer screen, because one thing was now absolutely clear. My father knew, years ago, long before any of this happened, long before Vanessa became president. Long before Ryan and I inherited the property, Dad knew, and somehow he had chosen not to tell us. The realization bothered me more than anything else, not because I doubted him. Because I trusted him, which meant he must have had a reason, a very good reason. Then Ryan noticed something. "Ethan, what?" He pointed toward the file list. The recording wasn't the only file on the flash drive. There were dozens: meeting notes, correspondence, scanned documents, audio recordings, photographs, years of information. My pulse accelerated. Dad hadn't collected a few records, he had built an archive, a secret archive, one that somebody clearly wanted badly enough to break into our property. Then we opened another folder. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Some showed construction projects, others showed boundary markers. Several contained survey equipment, then one image stopped me cold. The photograph showed Vanessa, not current Vanessa, much younger Vanessa, standing beside a fenced section of disputed land. The picture itself wasn't unusual. The date was 19 years earlier. Long before she joined the HOA board, long before she supposedly became involved in HOA matters. I zoomed in, then closer, then even closer. My heart skipped a beat, because Vanessa wasn't alone. Standing beside her was the original developer, and between them sat a large sign. A sign covered by a tarp. Only one corner remained visible, just enough to read a few words. Future development site. Ryan immediately noticed it too. What development? I shook my head. I don't know, but now another question had appeared, a very important question. Why would disputed land be labeled as a future development site? The answer wasn't in the photograph. Unfortunately, something else was, a date, and that date created a brand new problem. Because the photograph had been taken almost a year after the development proposal was officially rejected, I stared at the image, then at the date, then back at the image. Nothing made sense. If the project had been rejected, why were they still discussing future development? Unless, the thought hit me so suddenly I actually sat back in my chair. Ryan noticed immediately. What? I looked at him. What if the land was never the goal? He frowned. What does that mean? I pointed toward the photograph. What if they weren't trying to own the land? Ryan looked confused. Then I pointed at the sign. The tarp, the developer, Vanessa, everything. What if they're trying to control something else? The room became very quiet, because suddenly the violations, the lawsuits, the false boundaries, the pressure campaign, the break-in. The stolen survey box, none of it looked random anymore. It looked targeted, like pieces of a much larger plan. Then my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. I answered, "Hello." For several seconds nobody spoke. Then a man's voice quietly said, "You're looking in the wrong place." Every muscle in my body tightened. "Who is this?" The caller ignored the question. "The land isn't what matters." My pulse accelerated. "What are you talking about?" The man lowered his voice. "Check the water." Then the call disconnected. I stared at the phone. Ryan stared at me. Neither of us spoke, because suddenly one thing became painfully obvious. Someone knew we had found the flash drive. Someone knew we were investigating. And somehow, someone knew exactly which questions we were asking. For several seconds after the call ended, neither Ryan nor I spoke. The silence inside the office felt heavier than before. The land isn't what matters. Check the water. Those 6 words refused to leave my head. Every major problem we'd uncovered so far revolved around land ownership, the false boundaries. The rejected map, the hidden survey records, the legal filings, the break-in, everything pointed toward property. Yet whoever called me seemed convinced we were focused on the wrong thing. Ryan finally broke the silence. "What does that even mean?" I looked at him. "I don't know," and that was the truth. For the first time since this nightmare began, I genuinely had no idea where the next answer might be hiding. Then I remembered something. One of the old maps from Dad's envelope. The map covered in handwritten notes. I quickly unfolded it across the desk. Ryan leaned closer. For several minutes we examined every marking, every arrow, every note, every circle. Then suddenly Ryan pointed toward the northern section of the property. There, I followed his finger. A large blue circle surrounded an area near the disputed land. Beside it, Dad had written only 3 words, "Monitor water activity." My pulse immediately accelerated. The exact same word, water. I stared at the note, then at Ryan, then back at the map. Neither of us liked where this was going. The following morning, we headed toward the northern boundary before sunrise. The area sat nearly half a mile beyond the disputed section. Most people never went there. Dense trees surrounded the location. The terrain was uneven, and the nearest road sat far enough away that almost nobody would accidentally stumble across it. As we approached, something immediately felt strange. The ground showed recent tire tracks, large tire tracks, heavy equipment, not farm equipment, construction equipment. Ryan crouched beside one of the impressions. These are fresh, I nodded. The tracks couldn't have been more than a few days old. The problem was simple. Nobody had permission to operate heavy machinery on that part of our property. Nobody. We followed the tracks deeper into the trees. About 10 minutes later, the forest opened into a small clearing. Then both of us stopped, because sitting in the middle of the clearing was a pumping station, not an old one, a modern one. Steel fencing surrounded the structure. Warning signs covered the perimeter. Several industrial pipes disappeared underground. I stared in disbelief. What the hell is this? Ryan looked just as confused. Neither of us had ever seen the facility before. Yet according to the equipment, it had been operating for years. The realization immediately bothered me. How do two people spend their entire lives on a property and never notice an industrial pumping station? Then I saw the answer. The facility sat just beyond the disputed boundary area. The exact section Vanessa was trying to claim, almost as if somebody wanted control of that specific location, not the whole property, just that part. Suddenly, the anonymous phone call made a lot more sense. Check the water. A chain-link gate blocked the entrance. The lock looked new, very new. Ryan examined it. No county markings. What about utility markings? He shook his head. Nothing. That made the situation even stranger. Facilities like this normally carried ownership information. This one didn't, almost as if somebody didn't want people asking questions. Then I noticed movement. A vehicle, far beyond the trees. My stomach tightened, because it wasn't a county truck. It wasn't a utility company vehicle either. It was a black SUV. The same black SUV Vanessa drove. Ryan saw it too. Neither of us moved. The SUV stopped roughly 200 yards away. Then another vehicle appeared, and another, 3 vehicles total, all arriving at a remote pumping station hidden on disputed land. That wasn't normal, not even close. We quickly moved deeper into the trees and watched. A few minutes later, Vanessa stepped out. 2 men followed her. One carried a clipboard, the other carried a metal case. The group entered the facility through a side gate, then the gate closed behind them. Ryan looked at me. You seeing this? I nodded. Something about the entire scene felt wrong, very wrong. Nobody visits a remote pumping station surrounded by disputed property unless that facility matters. The question was why. Then I remembered the photograph. The one showing the future development site sign, the one taken years after the project had supposedly been canceled. A terrible possibility entered my mind. What if the development project had never actually ended? What if it had simply changed? The thought refused to leave. Because the more pieces we uncovered, the more everything seemed connected to that same section of land. Not the ranch, not the subdivision, just that one area. The area containing the pumping station, the area containing the false boundaries, the area somebody had spent decades protecting. Then Ryan quietly grabbed my arm. What? He pointed toward the facility. A worker had opened one of the large steel doors, only for a few seconds, but it was enough. Because through the opening I saw something that made absolutely no sense. Stacks of filing cabinets, hundreds of boxes, shelves filled with documents. For a moment I thought I had imagined it. Then the door opened again. The contents were clearly visible. Records, thousands of records, stored inside a pumping station. My pulse immediately accelerated. Water facilities don't store decades of paperwork, at least not like that. The site made no sense, unless the building wasn't being used only as a pumping station. Then another memory hit me. The break-in, the stolen survey box, the missing documents, the hidden records, suddenly everything clicked together. Someone wasn't trying to protect land, someone was trying to protect information. And whatever information sat inside that building had apparently been worth protecting for nearly 25 years. The facility door closed. The workers disappeared inside. Vanessa remained near the entrance speaking with one of the men. Then something happened that instantly changed the situation. The man handed Vanessa a folder, a very familiar folder. Even from a distance I recognized it. Black cover, white label, county archive markings. My blood ran cold because there was only one place I had seen those markings before. The county records office, the same office where Frank had shown me the rejected development maps, the same office where I had started asking questions less than 48 hours earlier. Which meant one of two things: either someone inside the county records office was helping them, or someone had just removed documents they were never supposed to have. And for the first time since this investigation began, I realized we might not be dealing with just an HOA. We might be dealing with something much bigger. For several seconds, I couldn't take my eyes off the folder. Even from where we were hiding, I recognized the markings: county archive labels, official record identifiers. The kind of documents that weren't supposed to leave government storage without authorization. Yet there they were, in Vanessa Drake's hands, at a facility hidden on disputed land. Miles away from where those records should have been, Ryan was staring at the same thing. "Tell me I'm seeing that wrong." I didn't answer because he wasn't, and we both knew it. The question wasn't whether Vanessa had county documents. The question was how she got them. The answer to that question had the potential to be far more dangerous than anything we'd discovered so far, because fake maps were one thing, missing surveys were another. But if somebody inside county government was helping them, then the entire situation changed. The facility gate opened again. One of the workers stepped outside carrying another box, not a small box. A large archive box, the same kind used by county records offices. My stomach tightened. Then another worker appeared, and another, each carrying more boxes. The men loaded everything into the back of a white utility truck. The process looked practiced, efficient, routine, as if they'd done it many times before. That was the moment I realized this wasn't the first transfer. It was simply the first one we'd witnessed. Ryan seemed to reach the same conclusion. "How many times do you think they've done this?" I didn't like the answer forming in my head, because if they'd been doing it for years. Nobody knew how many records had moved through that facility. Nobody knew what had disappeared. Nobody knew what had been altered. Then something unexpected happened. Vanessa looked directly toward the tree line, toward us. My pulse instantly spiked. For a split second, I thought we'd been spotted. Then she turned away. But the brief moment was enough to remind me how dangerous the situation was becoming. We weren't just investigating an HOA anymore. We were watching people who had spent decades protecting a secret. People who clearly had access to resources they shouldn't have. People willing to use law enforcement, legal filings, and intimidation to get what they wanted. Those weren't people who reacted calmly when threatened. After another 20 minutes, the vehicles finally began leaving. Vanessa departed first, the utility truck followed, then the final SUV. Only after they disappeared did Ryan and I move. We waited another 10 minutes just to be safe. Then we approached the facility. The gate had been locked again. The chain looked heavy. "Industrial grade, designed to keep people out." Ryan examined it. "No cameras." I frowned. "What? No cameras?" That immediately struck me as odd. A facility storing expensive equipment should have cameras. A facility storing sensitive records definitely should, yet I couldn't find a single one. It felt less like security and more like secrecy. Then Ryan pointed toward the fence. Over there, a section of chain-link fencing had been damaged, not enough to attract attention, just enough for someone determined to squeeze through. 5 minutes later, we were inside. The facility looked even stranger up close. Industrial pumps occupied one section of the building, but they weren't the primary feature. The primary feature was storage, rows and rows of storage, shelves, cabinets, boxes, thousands of files. The place looked less like a utility station and more like a private archive. Neither of us spoke. We simply walked deeper inside. Every step raised more questions. Why store records here? Why hide them? Why keep them off-site? Then we found the answer, at least part of it. A large room sat near the rear of the facility. Unlike the others, this room was locked, very locked, heavy steel door, electronic keypad, reinforced frame. The kind of security usually reserved for valuable assets. Ryan stared at it. "Whatever matters is in there." I nodded. The problem was getting inside, then fate stepped in. A worker must have left in a hurry, because taped beneath a nearby desk sat a small card, security access. The moment Ryan found it, neither of us could believe our luck. 30 seconds later, the keypad turned green, the lock clicked, and the door opened. I wish it hadn't, because what we discovered inside changed everything. The room wasn't filled with equipment. It wasn't filled with utility records, it wasn't filled with construction plans, it was filled with people. Photographs of people, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every wall was covered. Residents. Developers, surveyors, county employees, contractors, board members, entire families. Some photos were decades old, others were recent, very recent. My stomach immediately tightened. Because this wasn't record keeping, it was tracking. Someone had been tracking people for years. Then I noticed a familiar face. Frank Dawson, his photograph sat pinned to a board. Beside it were copies of county employment records, phone numbers, vehicle information, meeting schedules. My blood ran cold. Ryan saw it too. What the hell? I couldn't answer. Because I had already spotted another photograph. Mine, a recent one taken outside my office. The image couldn't have been more than 2 weeks old. Beneath it sat notes, handwritten notes, dates. Locations, observations. The realization hit me like a truck. We weren't the first people to investigate, and we weren't being watched because of the property dispute. We were being watched because somebody considered us a threat. Then Ryan grabbed my arm hard. Ethan, his voice sounded different, almost frightened. I turned. At the far end of the room sat a large corkboard.